Today is Wednesday, May 13th. This is VOA's International Edition. I'm Lori Lundin in Washington. Coming up, a historic standoff as the U.S. Supreme Court weighs whether the president's tax return should be made public.
Every president voluntarily turned over his tax return. So it gets to be a pitched battle here because President Trump is the first one to refuse to do that.
The top U.S. health official warns cities and states about reopening too fast.
There is a real risk that you will trigger an outbreak that you may not be able to control.
Also ahead, if you test positive for the COVID-19 antibody, are you immune from getting reinfected? It's all on today's International Edition. The top U.S. infectious disease expert warned Congress Tuesday that if the country reopens too soon during the pandemic, it will bring needless suffering and death and set back any economic gains. Dr. Anthony Fauci was among a number of experts testifying before a Senate panel.
It would almost turn the clock back rather than going forward.
Joining us to talk more about the hearing is VOA congressional correspondent Katherine Gypson. Katherine, what can you tell us?
Well, I think what was interesting about this hearing was just from the way it looked and appeared on TV is the fact that Dr. Fauci and a lot of the nation's other top health experts were not even on Capitol Hill for this hearing because, of course, they were exposed to the coronavirus in the White House and had to kind of do this partial self-quarantine and appear in the hearing via video conferencing. Then when you talk about the room itself, the hearing room, it was really interesting to see how many people were wearing masks, how many people were not wearing masks, and how that really broke down by party affiliation, which really speaks to the way that this is developing into a political debate here in the United States. This whole issue of balancing, reopening the country, restarting the American economy, with concerns that if we do that too quickly, we may have more coronavirus hotspots around the country. And that's exactly what Dr. Fauci warned lawmakers about in his testimony.
A big issue from the beginning has been not enough testing. And that's, I think, what health officials have been concerned about. Without testing, we don't know who maybe have been exposed. What did they say about that?
Right. So we really got some clarity out of the hearing when one of the health experts from the Health and Human Services Agency said that the U.S. would have the ability to conduct about 40 to 50 million tests per day by September. He was touting that as really something that would be an encouraging number for the U.S. to get back up and running. Of course, the question is, will that be enough at that point, particularly if we're facing a second wave of the pandemic going into the fall?
And there was a pretty stark warning from Dr. Anthony Fauci about opening too soon.
That's absolutely right. He kind of laid out this series of checkpoints that each area around the nation needs to clear before they move on to the next step in the reopening process. And he warned very sternly that if that area goes past that checkpoint too quickly, namely that first key checkpoint, which is a decrease in deaths from the virus in a 14-day period.
That's VOA congressional correspondent Katherine Gypson. Well, if you've had COVID-19, are you immune from getting it again? That is a question many people are asking as governments start to lift restrictions. Some nations are even considering visitors provide immunity passports, but viruses can vary greatly, and there's still a lot of unknown about this novel coronavirus. Joining us now to understand how people can know if they've developed immunity is Dr. Sanjaya Senanyake, an infectious disease physician and associate professor of medicine at the Australian National University. Thank you so much for being with us, Doctor. Is there any evidence yet that people who have had COVID-19 are immune from getting reinfected?
Well, they can't be sure that getting COVID-19 gives everyone who's had it immunity. So that is not certain at the moment. The World Health Organization has recently come out with a statement saying that as well. The problem is that this outbreak hasn't been around long enough, even though it seems like it's been going on for an eternity. It doesn't seem like it's been going on for long enough to test that hypothesis. So we will get to know that in time, but now we can only speculate. We have some data showing that some people who are infected with COVID-19 get a strong immune response. And in one of our medical institutes in Australia, the Doherty Institute, they looked at a fairly young person who had a mild case of COVID-19 and monitored their immune response, different aspects of the immune system, including antibodies, and found they had a good response. But the World Health Organization, in their statement, they looked at a number of studies that have come out so far that have looked at what we call neutralizing antibodies. And when we say a neutralizing antibody, we mean that an antibody that stops a virus from infecting a human cell. And they only found that some people had neutralizing antibodies and not all at very high levels. So that is of concern.
If you could explain what an antibody is.
When our immune system encounters a new infection, it needs to get a specific immune response to that infection. That's called the adaptive immunity. Now, while that adaptive immunity can take a few days to get running, so we've got an inbuilt immune response called the innate immune response, which is just sort of a general immune response that attacks any kind of infection. And while that innate immune response is going on, other aspects of the immune system are producing antibodies. These are proteins that recognize certain parts of a virus or a bacterium and will stop them from propagating infection. At least the ones that are neutralizing will do that. Every time we're infected with a virus, we get some sort of antibody response.
Some viruses that we're more familiar with come back and you can get them in a mutated form, like, say, the flu. Is it true that there's a possibility that this could be one like, say, the measles, that if you've had it, you won't get it again?
So that's a good point. We have some infections that we never get again, such as measles, but others which we do get again, which you've nicely illustrated with influenza, also tetanus, even if you've had natural infection. And a lot of that relates to the neutralizing antibodies, which stop the pathogen from entering a human cell. So we don't know whether this coronavirus is like that or not. Can we look at other coronaviruses to get that answer? Well, if we look at SARS, we know that people who've had SARS did develop quite a strong immune response. Maybe not everyone, but a lot of people, suggesting you get some sort of immunity. There are also 4 coronaviruses that have been circulating amongst humanity for the last few decades that cause about 20% of the common cold. We do know that you do get an immune response to that, but the immune response to those coronaviruses only seem to last for a short period. So antibody levels in one experiment, sort of 1 year after infection, were already starting to fall. So the authors postulated those coronaviruses, infection only would give you about 2 to 3 years protection before you were susceptible again. All the positive antibody blood tests tells us at the moment is that someone has had COVID-19 infection. We can't necessarily generalize it or extrapolate it to definitively say much more. Mm-hmm. As you say, even if it is an antibody that we think is a neutralizing antibody, protein, which we think is going to be a neutralizing antibody that should stop the coronavirus from entering a cell, we don't know for sure that that is the case. And even if someone's positive, we don't know if the levels are high enough to do the job effectively and protect them from a second infection. Having said that, with time, we will know. When we see more and more infections and we get a sense of whether people are being infected or not, then we will be able to say, yes, this particular antibody test being positive means you do have protection. But right now, we can't say that.
So would you say it's not really going to be helpful for people to get an antibody test if they have not been sick?
There is a benefit at a community level, at an epidemiological level, to try and understand how this virus has been spreading throughout a community. It would be useful to do what we call sero surveys of communities and take blood and see who's antibody positive, who's had the infection before.
Dr. Sanjaya Senanyake, infectious disease physician and associate professor of medicine at the Australian National University. The global COVID-19 pandemic continues to hit the United States very hard. More than 80,000 Americans have died. But through it all, health care workers have continued to work around the clock to stem the tide, usually at great risk to themselves. In the second part of our series of personal interviews with frontline workers, VOA's Adam Phillips spoke over Zoom with Dr. Rishi Pan, a critical care physician and trauma surgeon at Jackson Memorial Hospital in Miami, Florida, about the personal and professional challenges the pandemic is posing.
We're at one of the busiest trauma centers in the country, so we're used to a busy workload. But the psychological effects have been very wearying. And coming to work is very much kind of like steeling yourself for battle. It's trying to get your head in order, trying to focus, trying to think about your team. It's almost like maybe also going through a pilot's checklist, thinking, okay, what is my plan if this happens? What is my plan if somebody with a gunshot wound to the chest comes in and spraying respiratory secretions and potentially virus all over the place, but is bleeding to death? Who am I going to send into battle, or who's going to join me in battle and put themselves at risk? And then the process of putting on our protective equipment and taking it off takes many, many minutes. Our trauma patients sometimes only have seconds to minutes to live. And so we sit outside knowing that we have the opportunity to save this patient's life, but that if we rush too fast to get on our protective equipment, we may expose ourselves. So there are very unique aspects to managing this pandemic that affects the way that we treat patients and affects the way that we interact with our team.
Give me an example of a once typical procedure that you performed that you might think about differently during the COVID era.
Well, normally when someone's heart stops in the ICU, we do CPR. What we do know is that the act of CPR is an extremely high-risk procedure for the team. What we're doing to the chest when we push on the chest to try to restart the heart, what the lungs feel is the equivalent of a cough. And a cough is how COVID is spread. So when a patient dies, it sort of boils down to trying to choose whose life I'm trying to save. And it's a very unusual position, I think, for doctors to be in these days.
Decisions like that must be so wrenching.
Extremely, absolutely. And in addition, we know that part of the heart wrench of patients who have COVID is that they're alone in the hospital. Obviously, the nurses are at the bedside, and most nurses provide excellent comfort and bedside care. The doctors, we try to be there as well as much as we can. But it's different than having a family member at the bedside, holding your hand, hearing their voice, and hearing them tell you that they love you. So a lot of those patients, I'm sure, feel very, very alone. As much as we try to do to prevent that, it goes against what we've been trained to do.
It must be especially difficult when you see your colleagues come down with the COVID-19. That's not too unusual these days.
It's very hard to be really close to these colleagues and see all the things they've done and sacrifices they've made to help their patients now fall ill and be right next to their patients on life support, on a breathing machine, paralyzed. It really hurts. You think about their families or their children that you've met and that they're at home scared without their parent. And then you realize that they got sick doing the same thing that you're doing. And you're wondering, will I get sick too? Will I be next to them on a breathing machine? Will I not be able to say goodbye to my family? Will I die alone? And it's hard to keep those thoughts out of your head. Did I do something today that's going to make me infected? That's going to have me end up being a patient in the ICU?
It must be so scary and disempowering to realize that your ability to help in so many cases is so limited, at least at this point.
Absolutely. Some of us are seeing more death in a shift than we've ever seen before in our lives. And so much of what we're telling each other is that we are not failures. This is not our fault that these patients are dying, that it's the disease's fault. We are doing the best we can. But in addition, we know that our ability to manage our life is being wrested away from us by something that we don't fully understand. And all of us are scared. But I think that the larger disappointment for me and for many healthcare providers is feeling failed by our governments. But the other side of that coin has been the faith that's been restored in our communities, and to see how the people around us are coming together and crowdsourcing to support each other in the vacuum that our lack of leadership has left.
Here are some of the other stories we're following at VOA. U.S. government officials are concerned that dual U.S.-Mexico citizens may flee to the United States if the coronavirus outbreak in Mexico gets worse, putting more stress on U.S. hospitals, especially near the border. The worries, which have not previously been reported, come as hospitals in the San Diego area of Southern California have pressed the Trump administration to do more to limit the threat of the virus crossing into the United States. The World Health Organization said Tuesday that some treatments appear to be limiting the severity or length of the COVID-19 disease, and that it is focusing on learning more about 4 or 5 of those promising ones. The Geneva-based World Health Organization is leading a global initiative to develop safe and effective vaccines, tests, and drugs to prevent, diagnose, and treat the novel coronavirus, which has now infected approximately 4.19 million people around the world. South Korean authorities are combing through mobile phone data, credit card statements, and CCTV footage to identify people who visited nightclubs at the center of one of the capital's biggest novel coronavirus clusters. More than 100 new cases linked to the nightclubs have brought new fears of a second wave of infections in the country, which has been held up as a coronavirus mitigation success story. Stay with VOA for all the latest U.S. and world news.